Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now on our 37th episode of 2025. And before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco and Gaia, the platinum sponsors of Fiber for Breakfast. Well, last Thursday was the big deadline for the states to submit their benefit of the bargain final proposals to NTIA. And we saw 37 out of the 56 states and territories submit their proposals for review, and NTIA has committed to complete its review within 90 days of that submission. There's also 19 eligible states and territories that have been granted extensions, and we expect to see their proposals over the coming weeks. So I think about 90 or 57% of the allocations came in, so we still have a lot left that we'll see over the next few weeks. So, from a Fiber Broadband Association's perspective, we really appreciate the 4 years of hard work from all the state broadband offices for their dedication and passion for doing their best to try to get every location in their state connected with high-speed broadband. Congress is in session this week, and 2 hearings are relevant to FBA members. Yesterday, the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Communications and Technology held a hearing on public safety communications. And today, right now, the Senate Commerce Subcommittee on Science, Manufacturing, and Competitiveness is holding a hearing on President Trump's AI action plan, featuring testimony from Michael Crasio, the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology. Also a reminder that comments for the Universal Service Fund Working Group are due this coming Monday, September 15th, and the Fiber Broadband Association has circulated a draft of our comments for our members to review. On Monday, September 8th, FBA submitted comments in response to the FCC's annual Section 706 Notice of Inquiry, determine whether advanced telecommunications capability is being provided to all Americans in a reasonable reasonable and timely fashion. So we are going to be on the road. So next, coming up this Tuesday, we will be in Spokane, Washington for our Regional Fiber Connect workshop. We hope to see you there. And after Spokane, we're going to be in Scottsdale on October 16th, in Kansas City on November 11th. And then we have our premier member meeting in Palm Springs on December 8th and 9th. So we hope to see you at some of those events. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest is Jim Stegeman, the president and CEO of CostQuest and Associates, discuss from data to deployment, powering smarter broadband decisions. Before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris from the team, who will walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us today. We appreciate it. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsors of Fiber for Breakfast, Gaia and Wesco. Now, as participants, please keep in mind you are in listen-only mode. However, we want to hear from you. To ask a question, please type it into the question box, which is located in the control panel in the lower left of your screen. This presentation is also being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours, and you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to respond. We appreciate your input. With that, I will pass things back over to Gary to get us started. Gary?
Thanks, David, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber Breakfast, our guest was Nick Saprito, the executive director and head of product for G Fiber Labs, to discuss fiber slicing, unlocking a more open, customized, and secure experience. So Nick explained how fiber slicing, we know about network slicing from 5G, but now applied to fiber, enables subscribers to create these virtual networks tailored to their applications, whether it's work at home or video gaming or whatever it is. But also, what's I think really important is that you can enable highly secure communications for things like online banking and other applications where security is paramount. If you missed last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest is Jim Stegeman, the president and CEO of CostQuest, discuss from data to deployment, powering smarter broadband decisions. Jim is the president and CEO of CostQuest Associates. He has testified before Congress multiple times and is a recognized expert behind the development of the latest generation of economic cost models and data used across telecommunications companies and government for broadband deployment analysis and valuation. Jim leads design and implementation of the fabric locational data adopted by the FCC for the National Broadband Mapping effort, which is driving the allocation for NTIA's BEAD program. Jim provides his expertise on the utilization of the fabric to develop national fiber to the premise for cost for NTIA. He's led the design and implementation of the Connect America cost model, ACAM, and that is still used by the FCC's CAP program to distribute $1.5 billion annually to fund broadband deployment. Jim has also led the design and coding and implementation of the broadband analysis model used by the FCC for the National Broadband Plan delivered to Congress. So welcome, Jim, and for audience, please type in your questions and go. This is going to be a really fun session. I'm looking forward to that. With that, I will turn it over to Jim.
So Gary, thanks for having me today, and looking forward to our discussion just on where we're at in the state of broadband in the country. As we reached out to you just to talk about this, we have just released our first Broadband in America report, in which we're trying to look at kind of what is that deployment of broadband in the country and how has it changed over time. We now have 6 time periods, so 3 years of data available from the FCC using the fabric that we provide to understand how broadband has been deployed, where the gaps are, and how that information can be used to drive smarter decisions going forward. So hopefully we can kind of dive into that today and get your thoughts as we walk through that. So as you mentioned, we did develop the fabric. That fabric was released, I want to say, June of 2022 was the first release of the fabric. There were some issues in that first release of just locations that we had to true up over time, but we think it's a high quality product, provides good information, and really has released a treasure trove of data available for policymakers, ISPs, and for residential customers and business customers to actually understand who provides service to their address and what is capable at their address. So I think to me, it's really released a lot of information that we did not have access to before that I think will just lead to better decisions going forward. So Gary, as you mentioned, the BEAD process, September 4th was that initial deadline for states. 37 of the states actually did get their preliminary results in, their final proposals. Those are going through curing right now, as I understand. So NTI is pushing back on the states to fix various portions of the final proposal so that they get them in a final format that then can be reviewed internally by NTIA. We don't know where in the process that is for NTI in any of the states right now, but we know states are going through that curing. What you see here is what we've seen in the results. This was pulled early last week, so it doesn't have all 37 states in, it has about 28. But what you can see on that image on the left-hand side is the deployment within states by the various technologies that were accepted by the state. And we tried to classify those into the major technologies with a catch-all of mixed. Mixed is kind of where the provider indicated that they were going to use a combination of potentially fiber, fixed wireless, and or satellite in their solution for the grant that they are awarded. So it's hard to determine exact locations from the initial information that was posted, but we'll be able to dive into that as more information is made available by the states to go through. But as you look at that across the states, you can see, Virginia had the award of most locations, followed by Arizona, which we are aware of. What's not on here are some of the bigger states of Texas and California, Illinois, that have received extensions of their programs, so we don't know where those will fall. But of the initial results that we saw for these 28 states, about 74% of the funding went to fiber for about 60, just a little bit more than 60% of the available BSLs. So BSL, for those that aren't aware, BSL is a broadband serviceable location. It's a building. That building can have multiple residential or business locations in it, but it is what is the measurement that the FCC uses for this and what NTI uses for funding. So as you look at that, the other one that jumps out is the LEO at 5% of the funding, but about 19% of the locations. So we know part of the benefit of the bargain was to open it up to alternative technologies, which indeed it did, versus how the BEAD program was initially set up, which potentially had a favored fiber deployment. So as you look at the chart on the right, what you see is kind of that deployment of BSLs that we've seen in those 28 states that we captured, about 1.8 million total. 1 million of those went to fiber with an average award of around 5,900. And you can look down that chart. But so far, what we're seeing is a very efficient program run by the states. And the state broadband offices are doing a wonderful job to get those final proposals in within a 90-day period, which was a very aggressive timeline for those parties. So that's kind of where we're at with BEAD. So as you think about the fabric and why the fabric was developed, part of it was to explore coverage of broadband across the countries at location level. In that data set, there's about 116 million locations, which we now understand what technologies are there, which ones are served, which ones are underserved. When the initial fabric came out, there's about 14 million DSLs that were or underserved. Currently, as of today, in the last release, it's around 6 million, but of those 6 million, about 2 million or 1.5 million actually have federal funded programs for those locations, so those will be implemented in the near future. When you talk about the kind of the move from 14 million and underserved to about 6, almost half of those were due to fiber expansion. The rest of them are mostly a fixed wireless solution from the licensed parties. But fiber is making a major contribution to closing that digital gap that we see in what a portion of the fabric approach was to understand that on and underserved portions of the country. When we look at the data, this is actually from the last release, so this would be version 6. Version 7 should be coming out probably in about, I want to say, a month and a half. Typically, it's in May and November, the FCC releases the latest broadband data coverage information. What you're seeing on this map is we mapped hex cells. So these, I think, are hex 8s. And what we identified in that hex cell doesn't have access to fiber in that hex cell. So any color on the map that you see, so the black, the blues, the reds, are where fiber has been deployed. White that you see on the map is where there is a lack of fiber deployment in those areas. And then the gray areas are those hex cells that are unpopulated. So you can see as you move west of the Mississippi, it becomes fairly sparse in population. But I would highlight, if you look at North Dakota is mostly deployed with fiber, which is, some people are surprised by that, but that's been North Dakota's approach to using universal service funds, their investment bank, and other approaches that they have that they've been very aggressive in getting that fiber deployed. So you can see the fiber is fairly extensive across the country. And when we first looked at this, I was surprised just by the extent of fiber in the country. In that last release in version 6, we passed over the 50% of locations in the country. BSL locations are fiber served. I think it's around 62 million. Total number of residential homes and businesses passed is about 84 million. So we're well beyond that 50% threshold. And what we're seeing is every release of that fabric, about 3 to 4 million additional locations are passed by fabric, mostly from commercial entities outside of federal funding. But federal funding is playing an important role in that, and we'll dive into that in some slides. So on this chart, what you're seeing is just kind of that growth in BSLs served by fiber, release to release. And as I said, we started around 46 or 47 million in June of 2022. We're now over 60 million, or 50%. You can see the breakout between rural and urban portions of the country. We're seeing growth on both sides. 1.5 million locations were served in this the last 6 months, which would have been between June of 2024 and December of 2024. There are 1,500 or almost 1,600 fiber providers reporting service across the country. There were 67 new fiber providers that came in that version 6. 75 of the providers more than doubled their footprint, so there's been some aggressive growth. For example, Cable TV of East Alabama, Everfast Fiber, saw growth of almost 700% in the locations that they serve. When you look at this, AT&T still remains as the largest provider, about 15% of all BSLs. They're followed by Verizon, Frontier, and then Quantum Fiber, which is the Lumen Fiber that AT&T is purchasing. So you can see there is a great concentration of those fiber locations in some of the bigger companies across the U.S. The one thing that we wanted to look at is the FCC not only publishes the broadband data collection. So where are those locations that are served or unserved in the country, but they also provide the broadband funding map. That broadband funding map captures which locations have received funding so that we can track how well that funding has achieved expansion of fiber in the country. So what you're seeing here is when we look at fiber deployment in the last quarter, in that last 6 months, about 12% of those BSLs were from federally funded programs. So it's making a major contribution. And when you look at the rural side, 31% of the expansion of fiber in rural areas is triggered by federal funding. Federal funding helps fill that gap in the business case. As you look out in rural areas, that density plays a major role in how the economics play out. And as you start to get down below 10 locations per mile, 15 to 10, it starts to become difficult to make a business case where you can get a return on and return of the assets that you deploy. And that's where federal funding comes in and helps. It provides and closes that gap so that an ISP or a broadband entity can actually then make the business case to deploy fiber and get those facilities out. So we see federal funding as plays an important role in expanding fiber throughout the country. These are the counties in which, in the last version, so version 6, that we saw the most growth. You'll see on here, there's a lot of counties in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico had their Puerto Rico Fund that funded about 1 million locations in Puerto Rico. So a good portion of Puerto Rico is now fiber served because of those federal funds. But you can see that massive growth in these counties of fiber, much of it driven by federal funds. And then the estimated investment that you see here is our estimate of how much capital would be deployed to reach those locations. And then with that, we estimated the number of full-time equivalents employed over the last 6 months. So you can see it's an employment driver locally for that build out of the program. And then once build out is complete, it provides economic growth because of the expansion of fiber to consumers, along with the ability of those local providers to employ personnel to maintain that fiber going forward. If you think of it nationally from the last 6 months, as we talked about, there's almost a 7% increase in fiber in that last 6 months. We estimate that's about $8 billion of investment made into the U.S. economy, 65% of which went to rural areas. From that, we estimate about 105,000 full-time equivalents over that 6-month period employed in outside plant, construction, in engineering, planning, for the deployment of those 4.6 million locations. In rural America, it's about 66,000. So you can see this expansion of fiber, the expansion of broadband is an economic engine, not only from the construction side, but then post-construction as people then use that fiber going forward. So as I mentioned when we started, Gary, we released in the last 2 months 2 Broadband in America reports. We started this 2 months ago. We thought it important just to get information out based upon what the FCC is releasing on broadband coverage. In our first report, we looked at the expansion of broadband in America. that we know that broadband coverage has, the number of unserved locations has dropped significantly over time. As we mentioned earlier on, we went from 14 million un- and underserved now down to around 6, a significant decrease. And part of that report just looks at how that occurred, who's contributing to that, and what are the major drivers behind that. In our second report, which we focused on fiber, we look at specifically how fiber has changed over time, what are the drivers, and some of the charts that you see that we walked through today are actually from that report. So all this is available on our website. You can look through it. We think it's just exciting information to look at. It's fun. I'm a statistician. I really like looking at this data just to understand the trends and understand where things are going. So then as you think about what this data unleashes, from my background and just looking at data, we now have 6 data points. We now have time series data available to understand how deployment across all technologies is changing over time. We can understand and dig into who are the companies driving this, where is it being driven, which geographic locations are available, that we can understand that, and we are working on tools and efforts to then forecast forward where we think this will continue. But this chart that you see here is available on our website. You can dig into it. It's at the county level, state level. You can look at units or locations. So for those unaware, as I talked about earlier, a broadband service location is a building. But in that building could be multiple residential units, like an apartment building. So you can look at it either by units or BSLs. You can look at it by provider, county, or state. And you can look at just that deployment over that 6-period timeline. To me, it's very interesting to see this. You'll see that as you look at the data, cable has remained relatively flat. It's not expanding, which makes sense that if you're going to build new, from our experience with providers, you're going to build fiber. You're not going to expand new areas with cable. You're going to expand new areas with fiber. So we see cable footprint somewhat static, but as you look at other technologies, they are growing, and that is fixed wireless and fiber as we move forward. When we look at fiber, the states with the largest deployments, we list them here, the top 10, Texas, New Jersey, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Ohio, Tennessee, California. That's not by percentages, just by pure count, which if you look at those are the most populated states in the country as well. But again, you can dive into this data just to understand what we're seeing in broadband deployment as we move forward in time. And then the last thing I'll show, and then we can kind of jump into the conversation, is the other thing this allows, and you can do this, I think the FCC has a tool to look at different providers from time. We've got our own tool, we call it Red versus Blue, simply for the fact of just trying to understand where is technology growing. So we just picked an area, Jacksonville, Florida. We looked at AT&T, so in the broadband data collection from June of 2022, we can see in that map that you see on the left-hand side, the red is where we see AT&T deploying fiber in Jacksonville. The green on the map that you see is actually, we can identify those parcels in the latest data that have split, which are typically triggers of where new deployment or new housing will be built. So we can look at that as well. In the middle image, which was now we're a year later, we're looking at IQ Fiber. You can see IQ Fiber, their deployment pattern is focused on the way, trying to understand where their deployment is. And then if we move forward 1 year to June of 2024, you can see how that area has grown. So from a competitive standpoint, from an understanding of how fiber is being deployed, what's available, this data provides an immense amount of information that we can dive into. We soon will have then June of 2025 to actually see how IQ Fiber has expanded in Jacksonville. And then, as I said, what we're trying to look at is forecasting that growth over time. We have investment estimates for each location in the country. From that, we can identify which ones likely make most sense from an economic perspective. And if we understand what the provider's budget is, we can forecast where we think they're going. That's what we're working on to help expand the information available from what's in the broadband data collection. So that's just a quick run through of just the information that we've seen, what we've tried to compile as we look through the broadband data collection data.
Thanks, Jim. This is fascinating and a lot of great data here. We certainly have seen, been on record growth on fiber deployment. Last year, we had 10.3 million homes passed, additional homes passed. We think we're going to get up to 12, maybe 13 million homes per year fiber. Our big constraint is labor, as you point out. That's fiber is super cheap, but the cost of deploying it is labor intensive. 66 to 72% of the cost is labor. So 4 years ago, so first of all, I look and, everybody's horrified that, maybe everybody's horrified that, fiber's only at 60, I'm looking at Wes Robinson's data, 64%, and you're saying 61, 62% of the BSLs. So if we think about this, so 4 years ago, we had 15 million unserved and underserved locations. And then now that 4 years later, when we get to the benefit of the bargain round, we actually get to hopefully a deployment situation, we're down to 4 million. So 11 million homes now are served that were not, that were allocated in funds. What are those 11 million? Are those largely been fiber from capital projects, which is largely fiber, or ARPA, or RDOF, or Reconnect, or any of those other or fiber investment, as you pointed out?
So when we look at the data, almost half of what has been deployed to get down to un- and underserved is from fiber. However, there's a remaining 2 million that have been funded with federal funds, ARP, RDOF, Enhanced ACAM, other programs that are yet to be built that will likely be fiber. So our expectation is that that gap that you're talking about, the 11 million, will be majority fiber that has closed that gap.
Interesting. So one of the other things, if things play out for the other, 43% of the allocation that's coming in with the 19 states and territories that haven't submitted, if it comes out 20% LEO, so that's about 800,000 families that are going to be without fiber. Assuming, if you say that fixed wireless is largely fiber and the HFC is largely fiber. So basically the non-fiber locations, 800,000 at the end of the day. So how is NTI going to look at, like, Kuiper is a fraction of the cost per location of Starlink's. And there's no incremental cost to serving a location when you by satellite. So how is NTI going to look at that?
Yeah, right now, based upon our understanding, the way it's being examined is the states ran their benefit of the bargain round, and entities came in with a quote of how much funds they require to serve those locations. Project Kuiper and Starlink came in with requested funds for locations, and then those were compared to fiber providers, fixed wireless providers, cable providers to determine who would win. Part of that process is to determine which ones are considered priority versus which ones are considered non-priority. So as you go through the simple scoring criteria that NTI laid out, which was cheapest priority should be selected first, you have to go through that process. And that's where Starlink and Kuiper have won, is through that simplified process that NTI came up with. And it really comes down to, these are just the funds they've requested. For most of the fiber, fixed wireless, and other entities, for them to get funding, they have to show proof of their expenditures. But for these entities, they will be funded based upon the revised guidelines over up to a 10-year horizon, based upon the awards made.
So one of the questions came in is, so why do you think that the fiber BSL numbers for majors like AT&T is always behind their public release data for fiber deployment?
Well, there's one item is, as I talk through this data, we're typically 6 months to a year behind So as we're waiting for the June 2020, what do you think of this? December of 24 number to come out, that will come out in November. So we've got this extended time frame from which we get the information made available to us. Actually, let me correct that. The December 2024 is out. It's the June of 2025 won't be out until November of this year. So there's that time gap. So the numbers I'm walking through today are about 8 months old. So that's in part why we're behind, just because of that reporting timeline. So it's a 6-month window of information being pumped out, the ISPs reporting back in, and then it's once the ISPs report back in, it takes the FCC about 2 to 3 months to then publish that information.
So last question, because we're a little out of time, but so how are you going to do this mapping going forward? So if a LEO location is, LEO, assuming it covers every location in the country, how are you going to determine what's unserved versus what's served? So you just look and see if a LEO location has received money, then it's served, or how are you going to work that?
It's an excellent question, and it's the dilemma raised by kind of the benefit of the bargain round, that when locations were made available for BEAD, satellite and unlicensed fixed wireless was not considered. BEAD then opened the process to allow unlicensed fixed wireless to be considered, and then opened it further to allow awards out to LEO. If you look at the current broadband data collection at the FCC, LEO shows up at, I think, at about 99% of locations across the country. So if you consider it a technology for service, then everything is served. If you do not, then we get into the dilemma that you just raised. How do you then qualify what is served and what is unserved going forward? And maybe it's just a qualification of which technologies you're looking at versus which ones you're not, or which ones were funded versus which ones are not. I think it's just something that we need to think about going forward.
So is an unintended consequence of being one of the 800,000 families that get LEO that now you're not eligible for any federal funding to get fiber in the future?
It is a consequence of the benefit of the bargain, and it would have been a consequence of the before benefit of the bargain, that LEOs were in, they were considered before benefit of the bargain, but they now have a equal consideration from a technology standpoint for the broadband offices. So those locations are now simply served by LEO and do not have access to other technology. So it does leave that potentially on the ground terrestrial access lacking.
I hate it for those 800,000 families. Jim, always such a great pleasure. You always have such fantastic data, and really appreciate all the expertise and insights that you provide. So thank you for joining us today. And I look forward to getting back next Wednesday. We're having my good friend, Greg Wilson, the founder and CEO of Ripple Fiber, discuss how building an ecosystem to fuel growth and longevity in a highly competitive market. So you're not going to want to miss that. And thanks again, Jim. We'll look forward to seeing more of your data.